Hi, good morning, Mary.
Hi, Louise. How are you doing?
Yeah, not too bad. Not too bad. How about you?
Good. Yes. Okay. Okay. Thanks. Not too bad.
Yeah,
We were
well,
just catching up on our conversations for the last 3 weeks and discussing the sort of process really that we've been through ourselves in the conversation and in the dialoguing, which has taken us on our own sort of journey in a way through unexpectedly, and it certainly wasn't sort of planned in that way, was it?
not at all, because I think when we initially spoke, we had an idea or a theme that there was something quite urgently being requested of us, I suppose, from the world, and how could we each through dialogue start to explore a sort of more expanded way of seeing in terms of what we're currently dealing with the global pandemic. So it was maybe a very quickly put together idea, which was the world is speaking to us, and how do we reply, and how
Mm.
we live is our response. And so week one we looked at noticing, so just slowing down enough to notice what's happening around us.
Mhm.
And then week two we looked at opening again through our different frameworks. So through looking at Renaissance art, or myself, using heart sense, or Goethean imaginal inquiry, and just sitting in that difficulty of that open space, because it's not an easy space to sit in when you're not first of all reaching for a solution or a conclusion, and just sitting in that noticing and opening and waiting.
Mm.
And then week three we reached grieving, which was I think we spoke afterwards. That was a very alchemical space that we landed in last week.
Mm.
This it felt, and I think we've just talked about this, it's felt as the weeks have unfolded that that the world has been reaching more into our lives and bringing ourselves more into the world
Mm.
in a very kind of mysterious way, because I don't have words to describe what's been happening. But each week we've shown up and maybe had similar ideas, or the conversation, the synchronicities or the similarities have been very distinct.
Mm.
And
Yes.
again, we were just catching up before we started this week's dialogue. And again, we've both arrived at a similar place in terms of the fact that we are going to be talking about colour and light, but that was independently.
Yes.
And so
Yes.
we set out with this sense that the world is talking to us, and how we live is our reply. And I guess in terms of depth psychologist Robert Romanishin's framework, he would say that when you set an intention like that, that actually the work can then reach out and claim you into
Mm.
its space. And I
Mm.
guess that's what we've been doing.
Mm. Absolutely.
It's
Yeah,
very, very profound.
it is. And also those things where you don't really want to sort of question it anymore. We've recognized it, and it needs to then be left alone to do its thing. It's quite tempting sometimes to sort of try and make so much more sense of something which is synchronicity has sort of taken over, or seeming coincidences, or but I think just to sort of not letting it be, and recognizing it sometimes is quite powerful. And also the sort of sense of wanting to do something, and at the same time not overdoing anything, or sort of chasing after things, has been an interesting balance to step between those two places. And I think it is very much the whole series of conversations that we've had have very much been about this sense of a betweenness, or an in-between of a something that's not neglecting anything else, but it's not a sort of place of neutrality either, but there's definitely a sense of a betweenness, which I suppose has come from the space that we intended to create through these dialogues and conversations, which oftentimes have had their own sort of life, taken on their own life, and their own sort of alchemical process has gone on. So it's interesting speaking about alchemy, because this final week, really, we were going to call it acting, or act. How do you then act differently in the world once you've gone through these sort of processes? And it certainly isn't a linear thing, because as we were saying as well, sometimes you can go through these feelings all in a day, many times. You know, you literally have your own little sort of births and deaths of thoughts, of ideas, of intentions, or of memories. You know, they come and go all through the day, all the time. And yet at the same time, I think there's sometimes an overarching larger sense that you're spiraling perhaps upwards and downwards at the same time. And that sense of that movement is very dynamic in the way of how we think and how we live and be. But it's interesting that when I looked at our notes, our sort of ideas, our headings for this week, and I thought acting didn't feel quite right, and then and then when I sort of thought about rebirth, and then that an alchemy, that really sort of resonated a lot stronger, because it feels so much less linear and more of a dynamic process. So that's really where we were sort of going to kick off, wasn't it? And then you described it. Do you want to say how you described it, as a sort of a dance in some way?
Yeah, so I think the first thing I said to you was I felt that whilst acting was important, and that was the theme of the week, that actually it felt like we needed something more. And so this idea of a dance or dancing came up for me, which is interesting. You'd had similar thoughts as well. So there's a practicality of the acting and how we do act in the world right now once we've gone through a process. But also remembering that we come back to, like you say, those mini deaths and rebirths all the way through the day. It's like a spiral. So you go back to the beginning, you go back to the opening, the noticing, the grieving, the acting, and I guess I was thinking, well, that is like a dance. So we've got this idea of the alchemical process, and I think both of us feel very strongly that we've been through these 4 weeks in conversation with the world. And within that, there's a spiraling sense of life's movement, which I think you've sort of said that you captured in the slides that you're going to show today.
Yes. Yeah.
And I sort of captured, sort of a little bit later.
Yes. Yeah. Very interesting. Well, shall I share my screen now, and then I'll bring in the first slide. So I just wanted to bring up this slide first of all, because we have continually talked about having some sort of a framework within which to understand our processes and what we go through, and in particular this series of conversations where we've gone from a sort of noticing to seeing differently, grieving, and the final conversation that we're having today. And Swiss psychologist Carl Jung, who I'm sure everybody has heard of, wrote a lot about alchemy, and he described alchemy as a psychological process which moves through layers of our psyche, soul, heart, and physical existence. So it has this sense where it's moving through every part of us, and either coming from within and moving outwards, or outwards and moving inwards, but both are often the case. But the first stage of alchemy is the state, sort of black state of confusion and chaos, but with the potential to change. So with the potential for things to change and to move. It's not complete stasis, and it's not a sort of dead state. It's a sort of blindness, really, which I would sort of liken to really the creative process as well, for instance, with anything, but also in particular with art, and having an idea or starting with nothing in the beginning, but just a sort of sense of something. And then the second stage is illumination, which is the presence of light, or albedo, which is allowing you to see. And actually that's quite interesting, because that sort of relates to one of our weekly conversations that we had as well. And this third stage he described as learning or discovery, changing form, and that also has its own colour. And then the fourth stage was transformation, the final stage, or rubedo, which is the colour of the sun as well, the sort of red fire, if you like. And that was the final stage in the psychological process of alchemy, but also the physical stage of alchemy, so the physical process, because it was an actual physical process of turning base metal into gold. But I think it has this wonderful correlation to the psychological processes and to the process of creativity that's always changing form. And interesting, when you look at these colours, the two in the beginning, the black and the white, are both the sort of essential colours that you need, this sort of blindness contrasted then with this complete illumination. So you go from black to white. And I think it's very interesting that in the Renaissance, the white and black were the two key essential colours, if you like, or one isn't really a colour, but that you need in order to create anything, because they gave the image a three-dimensionality. So without this contrast of black and white, it wouldn't be possible. And it's interesting that that really started to come into its own sense during the Renaissance. And these are Leonardo da Vinci's words on colour. So white, he said, is given by light, which is interesting, as Jung said the same thing with albedo and illumination. Yellow is given by earth. Green is given by water. Blue is given by air. Red is given by fire. So again, the sort of final stage of alchemy, the rubedo, the transformation. And black is given by darkness. So the white and the black are sort of, holding the colours on either side. They're the sort of non-colours, if you like, which give birth to the colours. But the colours are also completely matched with the elements in life, in the world and in the cosmos. So you've got earth, water, air and fire. The one that's missing would be, well, in the sort of Vedic tradition, would be ether. And I would liken ether to what Marsilio Ficino called spiritus, and which is the sort of very alive sense that is moving between all the elements all the time. So these colours, again, have a psychological and a spiritual, I would say, resonance with us when we see them. And so for the artist in creating a painting, such as Botticelli's Birth of Venus, he's incorporated all of these colours. So you've literally got the cosmos in the image, but radiating through its sort of physical articulated forms. And Venus is obviously the goddess of love and beauty. And here she is being birthed, from the wind here. But I'd say is like the spiritus sort of breathing. It's like earth breathing and giving birth to the image here, that we can see and feel through our senses. And it's this wonderful manifestation of the sort of creative process, not just in creating a beautiful work of art, but in our own creative process of living and how we interact with that process of living and being in the world. So we almost look at an image such as this and breathe it in. It's sort of like it's almost, I think David Fiedler said in his book Restoring the Soul of the World, that this is almost like nature's exhaled into this painting, which is beautiful. Yeah. Again, bringing us back to the senses, which is so important. We skip over the senses so much, but there's such a fundamental aspect or main aspect really of us being here on earth in a body, because we can't often remember other times we might have been in a body, if we ever have. So we don't want to waste our time being in a body not engaging with the world, you know, and sort of drifting off to other places all the time. But I think it's an absolutely beautiful painting, which when you really engage and take it in, it does encourage you at the same time to inhale. You know, it's this sort of reminder that you sort of inhale this beauty, this image, but you're inhaling this whole sense of being in the world. It's the sort of final stage of this transformation through the alchemical process, and this is its revelation in an image. You know, it's like everything in the world we see, and we were saying this before, everything in the world we see is an image anyway. So it actually brings you to the attention of what are the images that we're creating in the world, not only through our own lives and how we act or what we might make, or the sort of things that architects and painters are creating, you know, the artists are creating, but how are we acting and what are we putting into the world in the form of an image, which is also us. You know, we're also created in the image of something, aren't we, as human beings?
Absolutely.
So it's a painting that requires contemplation, really, and also something which would have been there in, most likely it was painted for Lorenzo de Medici, and it wouldn't have been on display in a church or anything like that, but it would have been in a room in their villa, and it would have been there to inspire wisdom-enriched conversations and for us to dialogue, really, in what we're sort of doing now, and not to sort of at the same time say, right, this is Venus and this is Flora and this is Zephyr and this is what's happening and that's it. It was actually there to create its own process of alchemy and thought and feeling and emotion and insight and wisdom. And that would come in sort of layers, and it would be different each time you return to the painting and see it. And so it is for us as well. It's a dynamic exchange that's happening all the time, and it's not something which is static, and it's not a dead object to be analysed. You know, it's very much alive. It's a living being, the entire painting.
It's absolutely stunning, Mary. There's so much going through my head right now in terms of, you know, what we've been sort of talking about over the last few weeks, but this painting seems to encapsulate, seems to hold all of that, really. It holds the noticing, it seems to hold that opening, and it holds that grief as well for, you know, you were talking about, you know, we've lost this sensory, this way of making meaning in the world through our senses, through our imagination, through beauty, through art. And for me, this painting seems to hold all of that. And then you were talking about Jung's understanding of alchemy and sort of moving through the different stages. And again, I can see that actually happening through the last 4 weeks of dialogue, through the different themes. But I can also now really, this painting is reminding me, it's so interesting, isn't it, when one doesn't look in a linear fashion and say this was painted then, and, you know, this is the type of canvas that it's painted on, that actually there's something else reaching forward towards me from the picture. And it's now reminding me of groundsel, that I spoke about in part 2 of the first week, which is this sense that of revelation, of sitting in the chaos and the confusion of the not knowing. And then something breaks through. Something is illuminated, and in that illumination there is much to be learned if we give it the space to speak.
Yes, I think that's a really relevant point as well, because especially when you look at a beautiful plant, you know, or groundsel in your case, or a beautiful work of art, or whatever it could be, it doesn't really matter what it is. But if it's something which is created by nature, or it's a work of art which has been created with a complete respect and love of nature, which this has, what you see in the final form is beautiful and perfect in its own way, which is almost like the final stage of alchemy. But the process for that weed or that plant or that work of art to get to that stage has not been a linear, easy process either. And that plant or nature has done a huge amount of work and drawn in an awful amount of energy and had this wonderful intelligence within it in order to grow this beautiful plant or weed or flower or whatever it is. And similarly for the artist in creating this, Botticelli wouldn't have just sort of turned up at the canvas and thought, oh, I'm going to paint this. I mean, this would have consisted of, first of all, for the artist, 3 years of training before they could even touch paint. So they'd have to learn how to draw in 3 different media before they could even go near a canvas, usually. And then there were many, many, many preliminary drawings and preparatory drawings of all sorts of different aspects in order to get to the final so-called masterpiece, which is the sort of final stage in alchemy. So I think what's wonderful about any of that is that it holds the tension all the time between how we must live, because it certainly calls us to accountability, and it makes you really think and consider, rather than churning out work, for instance, or just writing something for the sake of writing it, or just churning out a book for the sake of writing a book. It actually brings you to attention in a different way, where you think, I might as well, I bet it's better to take my time with something and create something which I feel is in line with what it is I really want to do, because that's the most important thing about it. And it's rather that thing is able to speak better in that way, or what it is you want to say, you're able to portray it and convey it in a better way, and that you're brought to accountability to something as well, So I think that's what's quite powerful about this. And I'll just show you the last slide, which is actually a modern day sculptor, Anthony Gormley, which I'm sure lots of people have heard of. And he explores in his work, sometimes I prefer his ideas to his actual works of art, but I do think he's brilliant. And he talks about art, and there was a wonderful documentary he made, I think it was last year, about how art began, and really speaking about it in this way where it isn't a dead object to be analysed, and that it's something which is participatory and has so much meaning and has had meaning for people from, thousands and thousands of years ago. And there's a quote from that documentary which I really like, where he says, "It is easy to think of art as an add-on, but it is best to think of it the other way round, that it's the doing it, seeing it, participating in it, which makes us, we become fully ourselves." There's almost that he's saying it's actually greater than us. It's something that we can create and participate in, but it's still greater than us. And I think that's very important with anything that you write, do, create, is that you should always have your attention on something other than the thing itself, because it makes it, or beyond it, or through it, because it makes it not just a thing. Then it makes it become something much bigger than that.
Yeah, absolutely.
And perhaps situates us humans in a different framework where, being an artist isn't just about being an artist. You're a sort of a channel, really, or you're a communicator of something which you've sensed and that is also trying to come through the art, and you're there to help midwife it and birth it into existence. And I think that can be applied to anything that you do in life, any sort of path that you follow, or any career or any profession. So it's very important, I think, to always have that sense of service to something bigger than yourself and then the thing itself as well.
Yeah, I completely agree, Mary. And it's this sense that something in the world is calling something forward from us in a participatory relationship. And it's this, I think we talked about this before, it's this 180-degree flip to a kind of an imaginal turn, but a turn that makes that has the potential to expand how we see the world and how the world is able to communicate with us through whatever language or whatever way each one of us in our uniqueness wants to bring forward.
Yes, yeah.
So be that art or writing or acting on stage, it's how we then communicate that to the world as a sacred relationship, sacred participation with the world, which is always inviting us into its space.
Yes, yeah, because we're only here for a short time.
Yeah,
aren't we?
Yeah.
So,
absolutely.
Whereas the world will carry on without us quite happily.
Yeah, and it will continue to keep inviting us into its space, and I think that really leads so nicely into the ideas that I was having before we met this morning in relation to Sir Isaac Newton and Goethe's different interpretations of colour and light. So I wanted to talk a little bit about colour and light and how Newton and Goethe saw them, which goes right back to these different ways of seeing that we've been talking about throughout these past 4 weeks. And I think also if we go back to the theme of the session this morning, which was how do we act in the world now, having moved through these alchemical processes, through noticing, opening, grieving, transforming, through the challenge, through the difficulty that's constantly spiraling and taking place in our lives in so many different expressions. How do we act? And I think the acting is important because it brings a practical sense to our lives, and we have to make decisions, we have to act. But then within that, there's also these different ways of seeing, which can open up to more expansive conversations with each other, ourselves, and the world. And so in the same way I think that you were thinking about acting, I was thinking about this idea of dancing, this idea of movement. And how do we act or move in more expansive ways in the world, as it is always inviting us into a conversation that encourage us all to flourish, really, in a way, rather than just focus on a sort of dead mechanical solution. And so I wanted to give 2 different examples of seeing colour and light. So we have Newton, and I'm sure we're all very maybe familiar with Newton's ideas of colour and light. Maybe we did this in school and learnt about his experiment. And so Newton used a prism as a tool to investigate light, and through experiments and mathematics he demonstrated how his theory of light without colour can be shown as many colours within light when shone through a prism. And this theory was later interpreted by his contemporaries as showing the separation of light into separate colours. However, philosopher of science Henry Bortoft actually points out that what this theory is, it actually demonstrates a way of seeing that is projected onto the colours as they appear through a prism. So it's kind of not using oneself as an apparatus of seeing and being in the world and understanding, but that actually something has been created outside of ourselves to see colour, and that is then taken as the way that colours and light appear. Whereas for Goethe, he looked differently, and not to say that Newton is wrong. That's not what we're saying. We're saying it's a way of seeing. But it actually makes that way of seeing quite narrow in its gaze, because it takes out the person from the experience. It takes the experience out, and then you've left the theory in the apparatus, in the prism of light and colour. Whereas for Goethe, he was, again, trying to make himself a more transparent organ of reflection. So the world for him was reflected in how he saw. And so it was deeply participatory. So for Goethe, he offers a relational approach to light, starting with the introduction of dark. So he didn't believe that tools were required to investigate natural phenomena, and he understood that each phenomenon is its own theory. And so a theory of light should be able to be perceived through observing the phenomenon directly as part of one's lived experience. And this is where you bring all your feelings and intuition and imagination and sensing. They're all working together along with your intellectual mind. So Goethe's issue with Newton was that coloured light cannot be observed directly in nature, and that colours do not appear through the existence of light alone. So when Goethe investigated Newton's theory and observed the colours through a prism, he realised that the colours appeared only where there was a boundary. And so for a colour to arise, there must be light and dark, and not just light. And so he saw this as the coming into being of colour through the relationship of light and dark, which can be observed directly in nature. And it's such a different way of seeing it. It's a flipped way of seeing, that sort of you can see this happening at the horizon, for example, in a morning when the sun is rising. And so you get a kind of lightening of the dark. And then similarly, when the sun is setting at night on the horizon, you get a darkening of the light. And so if you see the two sort of colour palettes on the right hand side of the screen, this is what he was trying to show in his understanding of colour arising.
That's absolutely fascinating, because it's completely, I mean, obviously Goethe's after the Renaissance, but it was the complete sort of discovery in the Renaissance of light and dark colours together, in order to create the basis for colour to exist within that. And it's also a deeply philosophical sense that we grapple with, because you have to have contrast in order for anything to come into being. It can't exist without contrast. So, and it's exactly what he's saying there.
Exactly. So the light and the colour, the expression of the world's light and colour draws us in once more as a conversation. So just as Newton's theory expresses a reflection of an analytical way of seeing separately, Goethe was expressing the phenomenon as its own living theory through his dynamic way of knowing the things in terms of themselves. And so whereas the Newtonian view has reduced the phenomenon of light to an abstract theory, Goethe's way of seeing allows a phenomenon to reveal itself through itself and in terms of itself. And that enabled Goethe to see a living pattern expressed directly by the phenomenon, and revealing colour as being the emergence of a relationship between light and dark. So exactly what you were saying, Mary, about the Renaissance painters and how they were seeing, and how they were then translating that onto canvas. Or into sculpture.
Yeah, absolutely. Because it's all of this is actually presenting something deeply philosophical, isn't it? But it's bringing it into a physical articulation and a manifestation of those principles in that contact, and that contact also happens between us, the participant, in how we relate to that we're seeing, and how we're seeing.
Well, absolutely, because in dialogue, Mary, I was just thinking as you said that, you listen and you allow the other to become who he or she wants to be or needs to be, through allowing them to express themselves. And just as you allow that for the other allows that for you. So that's also a kind of alchemical, dialogic process that's continually happening. It's not just between people, that can happen between light and dark, between the artist and the canvas, between the world that's speaking to us, between the plant and the person who's observing. So to see in this way is to notice and to open in a sort of expansive way, where you open up a pathway, as Goethe said, of living knowledge, where you use all of your faculties of knowing, not just the intellect. If you bring in, this dialogic process through imagination, feelings, and intuition, you can start to see the connections in a wider context, bringing in that movement, human behavior, human sensing and experience, and also how the world speaks to us into this kind of vessel, this alchemical vessel, which I think we've experienced, haven't we, Mary, over the last 4 weeks? It's become like a process of alchemy as we've listened and allowed the world in, allowed ourselves in.
Absolutely.
And moved and danced between each other, which is why it takes you back to this dance. In the dancing there's acting, but in the acting there's dancing.
Yes, absolutely. And I think it's interesting because you're so right there where you say, when you have a conversation, there's so many different sorts of conversations that we hear today, and so-called dialogues or debates, and they're not actually debates, they're just one trying to get one up on the other, and the other side rarely listens to the other. And you see this not just in political situations, but also in somebody interviewing somebody else who might not be a particularly good interviewer, and they just want to get to a point where they're saying, well, we want to say what they want to say, so they'll ask a question to move it in their direction, rather than sitting and listening and allowing that other person to say what they need to say and listen. And even if they don't fully agree, well, that's fine, but you can just listen and allow that person to say what they need to say, because no two people ever see in an identical way entirely,
No,
so it has been very special doing this. It's been a really lovely practice, actually, to learn to do this better. And I've noticed, with my friendships and friends and so forth, perhaps I listen to them in a different way, or I'm a better listener. Through practicing, we get better through practicing things. If you don't do anything at all, then how can you ever expect to get better at things if you're just sort of sitting with the thoughts in your head all the time? So that physical thing of actually, again, bringing it back to the sort of, the physical, tangible, lived existence, it is about re-engaging and being in dialogue with the world, as you say so beautifully here around you.
It's definitely a practice, Mary. I mean, I can really resonate with what you're saying. These past 4 weeks have really made me or forced me into a place of contemplation and practice, and noticing when I'm maybe not moving into that more expansive space, and sort of inviting and participating in the dialogue, be that with the world or another person. Again, it's a practice. You might not get it right all the time, but to keep coming back to this sense, this idea. I just wanted to read something by physicist Arthur Zajonc in his essay on colour and light, I think it is. Light and Cognition. It's in the book Goethe's Way of Science. And I think this so beautifully encapsulates, Mary, what we've actually been sort of talking about today. And he says, our manner of thinking has shaped the planet and ourselves, and has the power to reshape them once more. And if we contrast that between Newton's way of seeing and Goethe's way of seeing, or this kind of heart sense way of seeing, or Renaissance art way of seeing, that's so pertinent, isn't it? And we can also bring in Ian McGilchrist there with his sort of left and right brain hemisphere ways of seeing working together or not working together. And we have a left brain hemisphere world that is so anorexic and has maybe helped us not to communicate with the world, and led us into such devastation and destruction that we see all around us today.
Yes, and I think the key there as well is that it's the working together, because you know, the left hemisphere is, when you said that sort of anorexic, where it really hit a nerve, and I suddenly thought, actually, the left hemisphere is struggling on its own. It also needs help,
yes,
from the right, and if it has the right hemisphere involved, the left hemisphere can function in the way it's supposed to function, because it's needed. And in a sense, it's the same with us, that, you know, you can be completely, you know, away with the fairies in the right hemisphere all the time, and if you don't have that sort of practical thing of engaging in the world and sort of doing something, again, the right hemisphere needs the left to function. So it's a complete working together, and with all these ways of knowing and seeing, to be, in order to bring a sort of more harmonious or broader balanced view of things.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we are in a space now, you know, having talked with you, you know, over the past few weeks, and looked at these different frameworks, which themselves, you know, have their own very long history and tradition. That when Arthur Zajonc says, you know, the monuments of our past speak of traditions that are sculpted not only our exterior landscape, but also an interior one as well. The textures and patterns of thought in which we now live are the outcome of hard-fought spiritual battles that established a general mode of discourse, understanding, feeling, and action. And he continued to say, while we may be unaware of their history, and I think this is what we're trying to do now, we might be unaware of them, but we're trying to bring them back because they are so important. While we may be unaware of their history, these traditions shape our habits of thought and understanding, our very seeing. So how we see, what we know, affects how we then act or dance in the world. And he finally says, in our own day, spiritual battles and new modes of knowledge are emerging that require fresh patterns of thought and unknown metaphors. These new ways of understanding will one day shape a future landscape. And I just wonder whether that's what we're all, you know, in our own particular ways, are, whether we're feeling a discomfort in the way that the world is presenting to us, or that we're acting in the world, that discomfort, or having frameworks that we've gone back to ancient traditions and ancient ways of thinking and seeing. Whether these are kind of reaching forward now towards us to say, you yourself as a human being can have a more expanded experience if you realize that you're all you ever need. And that if you bring all these separated parts together, the right and the left brain hemisphere, in McGilchrist's terms, the head and the heart in my own terms and my own research terms, you know, the intellect and the imagination in Renaissance art terms, the intellect and the imagination in Goethean inquiry terms, you have the opportunity to step into the world as a more whole person, which philosophically can only have, it must have an effect on how we then act in the world. So as I'm sort of thinking about this dancing between heart and head, between left and right brain hemisphere, what actually, and sort of very synchronistically, Mary, we were talking about light and colour, and I just went back in my old images in my computer yesterday, and I thought, I really want a rainbow. I really want to show a rainbow. And then I found this picture that I took of a rainbow over Canterbury University a couple of years ago. And then I also, in Arthur Zajonc's book, as I was sort of flicking through it for quotes for today, he also talks about the poet Gerard Manley Hopkins. And again, I thought, gosh, isn't this interesting? Synchronistically, the world's kind of reaching out, talking to me, talking to us, so we can have this alchemical conversation with the world and between ourselves. And this rainbow poem struck me, and I thought I'd just really like to read it, to sort of tie together maybe everything that we've been talking about. So Hopkins writes, "It was a hard thing to undo this knot. The rainbow shines, but only in the thought of him that looks, yet not in that alone, for who makes rainbows by invention? And many standing round a waterfall see one bow each, yet not the same to all, but each a hand's breadth further than the next. The sun on falling waters writes the text, which yet is in the eye or in the thought. It was a hard thing to undo this knot.
Beautiful, Louise.
And it's like this idea of where is the rainbow? Where is it? Is it in the rain? Is it in the sunlight? Is it in the eyes, or is it in the mind? And maybe for Newton, it was, in the prism, in the mind. But for the poet, it's somewhere else. And it's also in the mystical. It's in the unknown. It's in the chaos. It's in the confusion. Or is it yes to all? Is it moving between the head and the heart? And it can be all of those things. It can be in Newton's prism, or in the eyes, in the heart, in the rain, in the sun. And so I guess what I'm trying to say in this is that how we choose to have a relationship with life really does then affect how we then act in the world, how we dance with the world. And it really made it clear to me in this rainbow poem.
I think it's very beautiful. I think it's interesting how we can talk and explore, and that's so necessary. And poetry and art can just hold a sense of what you're trying to say, or rather what you feel, in a different way. And they each have their own language, don't they? And I think it's everywhere, isn't it? I mean, it's in all those places. But I think what the downfall really with scientific knowledge that we have today is that I think we absolutely need it. I think it's essential. And I like some of the scientific things that I read, but we shouldn't neglect the other side as well. And if you're able to keep a scientific sense of things, and at the same time keep a sense of wonderment and awe, which children always have. You remember that sense of, I was just looking at this and all sorts of memories were sort of flooding back from childhood, just looking at a rainbow, and they seem magical to a child, and hopefully they can still seem magical to us today, rather than someone looking at it and saying, oh, it's just a reflection of this and that, or whatever they might want to explain it in scientific terms. But I think that's very important, to keep a sense of awe and wonderment about the world. And that's the challenge once you have science's, hard facts sort of often shouting that down. But I think both are necessary. And it's interesting that the right hemisphere is actually empirical as well. And that's really what sort of came out in the Renaissance, in this sense of wanting to really show it, show the thing itself, and show the sort of tangibility of the thing, rather than it just sort of being symbolic. But I think it's a beautiful image to finish on here, which
I think so.
Is just lovely to contemplate, isn't it? And it's also so symbolic, the rainbow of hope.
Yeah, I agree. There is so much more that can be added to our whole lived experience of life when one is able to, contemplate more through these frameworks. It's a moving forward with both and.
Yes.
And Arthur Zajonc, I just thought this is a lovely kind of quote to finish on from the same essay. And he says, on nearly every front, we are called to reimagine the world we inhabit. It simply awaits an act of courage for us to begin, and patient perseverance for us to succeed in the self-conscious education now in our hands. And really placing that responsibility for that expansiveness of seeing, and bringing all of those different parts of ourselves back together on ourselves, in our own hearts, in our own body, heart, body, mind, soul, spirit, all of those parts, all the parts of the rainbow. And dancing with life and acting therein.
No, that's beautiful. That's a lovely place to finish and end our 4-week exploration. It's been really fascinating, and I hope others have found similar things that they can resonate with and also perhaps disagree with, which is also good. And it's been really a wonderful time and surprising, actually. I didn't think it would take us to where it has at all. So it's actually been a beautiful lesson and experience on that level too.
Yeah,
and we never scripted any of this, and we didn't even know, we've never known from week to week what each other might be showing in terms of our slides or anything. It's been sort of pre-thought out in our own minds, but then just sort of gone with it intuitively as well.
Yeah, it's been a beautiful dialogue between ourselves and the world, and the mysterious, all kinds of phenomenon. And yeah, it's been a real privilege. Thank you, Mary.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Louise. Take care.
Yes, you too.